The crowd gasped as the entitled tourist leaned in, a smug grin plastered across his face, and spat, right on the Mega Knight's helmet. The thick glob slid down the polished steel, glistening under the midday sun. A murmur of shock rippled through the bystanders, some pulling out their phones, others frozen in disbelief. The tourist, draped in designer brands, let out a laugh, folding his arms. "What are you gonna do? Just stand there," he sneered, daring the armored figure before him to react. The Mega Knight, known for his unbreakable discipline and unwavering patience, remained still. His towering figure cast a long shadow over the tourist, his broad frame unmoving, his grip firm on the hilt of his greatsword. A bead of sweat trickled down the tourist's temple. The silence stretched, heavy, suffocating. He expected retaliation, a reprimand, anything. But the knight stood resolute, his gaze locked forward, not even acknowledging the insult. The people around whispered among themselves. "Is he really just going to take that?" Someone muttered. "No way, he has to do something," another said. The tension thickened like a storm on the horizon. Then, with the slow, deliberate movement of someone who had faced far greater enemies than a spoiled man with too much money, the Mega Knight did something that no one could have expected. He took a single step forward. The tourist's bravado cracked, his smirk twitching at the edges. "Hey, wait," he stammered. But the moment had already shifted. The knight's presence alone was enough to make the air feel heavier. He towered over the man, his armor clinking softly with every motion. Then, without breaking his silence, without lifting a single weapon, he did something that sent chills down the spine of every witness. He raised a single gauntleted hand and pointed directly at the tourist's chest. The once cocky man flinched as if struck. The laughter that had bubbled from his lips moments ago now died in his throat. It wasn't just the knight's gesture, it was the message behind it. No words were needed. This was a challenge, an unspoken call to accountability. The weight of honor, dignity, and centuries-old discipline bore down on the man, exposing him in front of everyone. The tourist swallowed hard. The cameras were still rolling. The crowd was watching. And deep down, he knew this wasn't over yet. The tourist took a shaky step back, his confidence unraveling as the Mega Knight's silent judgment bore into him. The crowd was no longer just watching. They were waiting. The weight of their stares pressed down on him, harder than the knight's armored presence. Someone in the back muttered, "He should apologize." Another whispered, "What an embarrassment." The murmurs spread, feeding the tension like wildfire. The tourist forced a laugh, trying to mask his unease. "Oh, come on, it's just a joke," he said, his voice lacking the arrogance it had before. He wiped his palms against his expensive jeans, suddenly aware of how small he felt. But the Mega Knight remained unmoved. His finger was still pointed, unwavering, demanding an unspoken reckoning. The air crackled with anticipation. Every second that passed without a word from the knight made the tourist's discomfort more obvious. His mind raced for a way out, a way to shift the attention back in his favor. "What? Are you too scared to say something?" he blurted, desperation creeping into his tone. "You're just a guy in armor. You're not even allowed to fight back, right?" A chuckle rippled through the crowd, not at the knight, but at the tourist. His attempt to regain control had backfired spectacularly. The Mega Knight didn't need words. His silence was its own language, one that spoke louder than any insult ever could. Then, as if answering the tourist's taunt in his own way, the knight did something unexpected. He slowly reached up to his helmet, the metal gleaming under the sun. The air grew impossibly still. Was he about to break protocol? Was he going to remove it? The tourist's smugness wavered as the knight's gloved fingers grazed the chin of his helmet, but then, instead of lifting it off, he wiped away the spit. A single smooth motion. No anger, no aggression. just quiet, controlled dignity. The crowd erupted, not in laughter but in awe. The knight had taken the ultimate insult and brushed it away like dust. He was untouchable, unshaken. The tourist had thrown his worst, and it hadn't even made a dent. "Wow," someone murmured, "that's real power." The tourist clenched his jaw. He had expected a reaction, rage, a confrontation, anything to validate his actions. But now, he stood alone in his humiliation. He could feel the shift in the crowd. The respect that had once been his by virtue of wealth and status had slipped away. And the mega knight, without a single word, had taken it all. But this was far from over. The tourist wasn't ready to accept defeat. Not yet. What would you have done in this situation? Share your thoughts below and stay tuned, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The tourist's face burned with humiliation. His fingers curled into fists, his nails digging into his palms. He had always been the center of attention, the man with the loudest voice, the deepest pockets. But now, in front of a growing crowd, he was being overshadowed by a knight who hadn't even spoken a single word. Number. He wasn't going to let this happen. "You think you're better than me?" the tourist snapped, his voice cracking slightly. He stepped forward, invading the mega knight's space, trying to regain control. "You're just a guy in armor playing statue. You don't even matter." The knight remained still. His breathing was steady. His presence was unshakable. That only enraged the tourist more. "Do something!" he shouted, shoving the knight's armored chest with both hands. The metal didn't even shift. It was like pushing a mountain. A hush fell over the crowd. This was no longer just an embarrassing moment. It was turning into something uglier. A security officer, watching from the sidelines, took a step forward, ready to intervene. But the mega knight raised one hand ever so slightly, a silent command to wait. The tourist laughed, but it was forced, brittle. "Oh, I get it! You're scared! You can't fight back, can you?" He sneered and turned to the crowd, trying to rally support. "He won't do anything! He's weak! He's just a guy hiding behind some stupid armor!" But the crowd didn't cheer. They didn't laugh. If anything, their expressions had hardened. Some shook their heads. Others crossed their arms, unimpressed. The shift in the air was undeniable. Then the knight moved. Slowly, deliberately, he raised one hand again, not in anger, not to retaliate, but to adjust the heavy strap of his shoulder plate. It was a small movement, insignificant on its own. But the meaning was clear. He wasn't acknowledging the tourist's words. He wasn't reacting. He wasn't even treating this man as a worthy opponent. The tourist faltered, blinking in confusion. He had thrown everything he could: mockery, aggression, even physical force. And still, the mega knight stood untouched, as if the entire spectacle was beneath him. The power dynamic had shifted completely. For the first time, the tourist hesitated. He could feel it, his control over the situation slipping through his fingers. The crowd, once mildly entertained, was now watching with quiet judgment. He was losing them. Then, a voice from the back rang out. "You should apologize." The words cut through the silence like a blade. The tourist whipped his head around, searching for the source, but more voices followed. "Yeah, say you're sorry. Show some respect. Man, you lost. Just admit it." The murmurs grew into a wave, and suddenly, the tourist was no longer in control of the narrative. His heart pounded. He had never felt this exposed, this powerless. But he wasn't done yet. He refused to be humiliated like this. If the knight wouldn't respond the way he wanted, then he would force him to. The tourist took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing with determination, and then he reached for the mega knight's helmet. You won't believe what happens next. Stay tuned, because this is where everything takes a shocking turn. The second the tourist's fingers brushed against the mega knight's helmet, the air seemed to freeze. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Touching the knight was one thing, but trying to remove his helmet. That was an unspoken line that no one, no matter how rich or entitled, should ever cross. The Mega Knight moved faster than anyone expected. With a single, precise motion, his gauntleted hand snapped up, seizing the tourist's wrist mid-air. The sheer strength behind the grip was undeniable. Though the knight hadn't squeezed, the tourist's arm locked in place as if caught in a vice. The tourist's breath hitched. For the first time, true fear flickered in his eyes. The raw power behind that grip was overwhelming. It wasn't aggression, it wasn't retaliation, it was a warning. The crowd was dead silent. All eyes were on the two men, one trembling, the other unshaken. The tourist tried to yank his hand back, but the knight didn't let go. Not yet. Instead, the armored warrior tilted his head just slightly, as if silently asking, "Are you sure you want to continue?" Sweat beaded on the tourist's forehead. The bravado he had clung to so desperately was crumbling. His chest heaved with shallow breaths. He had pushed too far, and now he was trapped in a moment he couldn't control. The tension was unbearable. Then, just as smoothly as he had grabbed him, the Mega Knight released his grip. It wasn't a shove. It wasn't an act of violence. It was a statement. The tourist stumbled back, massaging his wrist, his face twisted with a mix of embarrassment and frustration. He opened his mouth, maybe to argue, maybe to curse, but nothing came out. He had lost. Not just the fight, but the respect of everyone around him. A new sound broke the silence, clapping. It started with one person, then another, until a wave of applause filled the air. But it wasn't for the tourist. It was for the Mega Knight, for his discipline, for his strength, for his refusal to stoop to the level of the man who had tried so hard to humiliate him. The tourist's face turned red, his hands curled into fists, but he knew there was nothing left for him to do. He had already been defeated in the worst way possible, not with force, but with dignity. With gritted teeth, he turned on his heel and stormed away, shoving through the crowd. The Mega Knight stood tall, unmoving, watching him go. But just as the moment seemed to settle, something unexpected happened. A small child, no older than 7, broke away from the crowd. He walked right up to the knight, eyes wide with admiration. Then, with all the innocence in the world, he lifted a tiny hand and saluted. The knight, ever so slightly, dipped his head in return. And in that moment, everyone knew. The tourist had never stood a chance. Have you ever witnessed true strength like this? Comment below and share your thoughts. And don't go anywhere, because the real lesson is just beginning. The tourist stormed off, but he could still hear the claps behind him, each one like a slap to his pride. His jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. He had never been embarrassed like this before, never been outshined, outplayed, and humiliated in front of an entire crowd. And worst of all, the knight hadn't even needed to speak. He shoved his hands into his pockets and kept walking, head down, trying to drown out the murmurs around him. He wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was somebody. Back home, people respected him, feared him. But here, he was nothing more than a fool who had been put in his place without a single word. But he wasn't done yet. As he turned a corner, away from the main square, he pulled out his phone and started typing furiously. A single post, a single video clip twisted with his own narrative. Abused by an out-of-control knight, unacceptable. He attached a snippet, just the part where the Mega Knight had grabbed his wrist, conveniently cutting out everything before it. He smirked as he hit post. Almost immediately, notifications flooded his screen. Outrage, support. People who hadn't even been there were calling for justice, demanding action. He had seen this play out before. Public pressure was a powerful tool. And soon this so-called Mega Knight would know what it felt like to be humiliated. Or so he thought. As he scrolled through the comments, expecting waves of sympathy, something strange happened. People were pushing back. "I was there. This guy was harassing the knight the whole time." Don't believe everything you see. This is edited. You got exactly what you deserved. The tourist's face paled. His own trick had backfired. More videos surfaced, uncut footage from multiple angles, showing everything. The spit, the shove, the attempt to grab the knight's helmet. And in every single one, the knight's composure was unshaken. The narrative had flipped. One by one, people turned against him. His comments section flooded with criticism. Some even dug into his past, exposing other entitled outbursts, other moments where his arrogance had cost him respect. Panic gripped his chest. His heart pounded as he refreshed his page, but the damage was already done. And then, the final blow. A response video appeared, one that went viral within minutes. But it wasn't the mega knight who posted it. It was a little boy, the same child who had saluted the knight. He looked straight into the camera, his voice small but firm. "My dad always told me that real strength isn't about fighting," the boy said. "It's about knowing when not to." The clip ended with an image of the mega knight standing tall, unmoved, dignified. The tourist's fingers trembled over his screen. He had lost again, but this time, there was no escaping it. Because this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about respect, about honor, about the power of true strength. And he had none of it. Have you ever seen someone get exactly what they deserved? Let me know in the comments. And don't go anywhere. The final moments of this story will change the way you see everything. The tourist stared at his phone, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was the victim here. He was the one who had been wronged. So why was the world turning against him? His fingers hovered over the screen, desperate to fight back. Maybe he could delete the post. Maybe he could twist the story even further. But deep down, a sinking realization settled in his chest. It wouldn't matter. People had seen the truth. And truth, once exposed, was impossible to bury. A notification popped up. An email. His stomach twisted when he saw the sender. His employer. "We need to talk." The weight of those 3 words sent his mind spiraling. He had built his entire reputation on his influence, his wealth, his ability to control situations. But now he was being reduced to nothing. He turned off his phone and shoved it into his pocket, his hands clammy with frustration. His entire life had been about winning, about getting what he wanted at any cost. And yet, today, he had lost. Badly. As he paced the streets, the laughter and whispers from earlier still echoing in his mind, he caught sight of a small cafe. Its warm glow spilled onto the street, the chatter of people inside a stark contrast to the storm raging inside him. And then he saw him. The little boy. The same child who had saluted the knight was now sitting at a table near the window, his legs swinging under the chair, talking animatedly to an older man, his father maybe. He was smiling, carefree, as if he had already forgotten the events of the day. But the tourist couldn't forget. Something about the boy's words still lingered in his mind. Real strength isn't about fighting. It's about knowing when not to. The tourist clenched his fists. Was that what had happened? Had the knight won simply by refusing to engage? Number. That couldn't be it, could it? He didn't know why, but his feet started moving on their own. Before he could stop himself, he pushed open the cafe door, the bell jingling softly. The boy looked up, their eyes met. For the first time all day, the tourist hesitated. And then, before he even understood why, the words slipped out. "That night," he said slowly. He didn't flinch, not once. The boy tilted his head as if waiting for something more. The tourist swallowed hard. His throat was dry. His pride was a choking weight in his chest. And then, barely above a whisper, he said the words he had never spoken before in his life. "I think I was wrong." The boy smiled, not in mockery, not in triumph, but in simple understanding. "Yeah," he said, but you can still fix it." The tourist blinked. "Fix it?" The boy nodded. "Just do the right thing." Such simple words, but they hit harder than any blow ever could. The tourist exhaled, his hands unclenched. For the first time in his life, he considered what that might actually mean. What would you do in his place? Would you own up to your mistakes? Let's talk in the comments, and stay tuned, because what happens next might just surprise you. The tourist sat down at the empty chair across from the boy, feeling the weight of his own actions settle deep in his chest. The boy's father glanced up from his coffee but said nothing, simply watching with quiet curiosity. The tourist hesitated. He wasn't used to moments like this, moments where he wasn't in control, where there was no escape, no way to twist the situation in his favor.